European Union. There will be a need for reconstruction after the war. But as you saw, all the ministers are already preparing reforms to pave the way for Ukraine's adhesion.
Well, I think that this unity that you observed today in this room is exactly what we need to repel Russian offensives and to defeat Russian aggression. It doesn't come without unity. One unity has to be ensured within the European Union, but another kind of unity also between Ukraine and the EU.
On the second day of his visit, the High Representative heads to the outskirts of the capital to meet with a demining team. Russian troops were recently pushed back from this forest, but left it filled to the brim with explosives. In order to find and dismantle landmines, these men are using brand new equipment financed by Brussels.
You're welcome to have a look inside.
30% of the Ukrainian land is contaminated right now.
30%?
And, you know,
30%? 4 times Switzerland
absolutely.
is contaminated by bombs or by mines.
Fully humanitarian demining will start at that point when war will end.
Next one.
We will try to bring more. So we will try to support you. And there is the first tranche of 25 million euros in order to increase your modern equipment, to save lives and to make your soldiers to work in a more safe condition. This is part of the terror. And the terror is one of the tools that Russia is using against the Ukrainians. The big terror, the big bombing, and then there is the small terror, the small mine in a wok that kills the children.
Josep Borrell isn't the only face of European diplomacy in Ukraine. Since the start of the conflict, a string of representatives, ministers, and even heads of state have traveled to Kyiv, each trying to douse the flames of war in their own way. Among them, EU High Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen and President of the EU Council, Charles Michel, are both visiting Ukraine for the 4th time in a year. This European summit was attended by President Zelensky, High Commissioner von der Leyen, top diplomat Josep Borrell, and yourself. When it comes to resolving this conflict, don't you think there could be too many European representatives attending these meetings?
I don't think so, because it takes a joint effort to convince the rest of the world to support us in our defense of international law. As you know, the EU derives its legitimacy from two things. On the one hand, the European Parliament and the Commission, which represent the common interests of Europe. And on the other, the individual member states with their own democratic process, which help put these decisions into practice. What really matters is that we stay united, as we have done so far. As the curtain falls on this landmark diplomatic summit at the heart of the conflict, it's now time to head back to the safety of the EU's internal borders. It was a strange start to the day in Kyiv. An emergency alarm went off in the city. Can you tell us what happened?
Yes, we had to take refuge in a bomb shelter because of the siren. We stayed there for half an hour and then got out. It's not unusual. Radars detected Russian aircrafts near the border with Belarus. They could have reached Kyiv in a few minutes. Their aim might have been to delay the summit.
You spoke of Ukraine's desire to join the European Union. President Zelensky is hoping for a positive report from the Commission in the autumn, which could pave the way for accession talks. Some ministers mentioned a 2-year timeline. Is that realistic for a country at war?
Ukraine could have ended up in Russia's sphere of influence, much like Belarus. But with the latest developments, Ukraine will certainly join the European Union. In 1, 2, or 3 years, I don't know. It depends on the conflicts, which is preventing the necessary reforms. It will depend on the country's ability to reform. But Ukraine has made its position clear, and I think the EU has as well.
There's a high price to pay, especially regarding the cost of energy, which continues to rise for Europeans.
We don't have a choice. We can't continue to import Russian gas like nothing happened. And alternatives are obviously more expensive. Costs have begun to drop after being inflated by speculation in August. And we are now back to pre-war prices. But we need to think of this as a geopolitical statement about our role in the world.
You said that the EU has already invested nearly 60 billion euros, including through member states' individual contributions. But the US has done a lot more, including supplying weapons. Do you think that matters more to President Zelensky?
Europe contributed around 40% of US military aid to Ukraine. If we add everything up, the EU actually does more. And we also need to take into account the cost of hosting nearly 5 million Ukrainian refugees.
With 40% of Ukraine's infrastructure destroyed, isn't it too ambitious to start rebuilding during the war?
I don't think so. If you live in a house that's been bombed, you don't want to wait until the war is over to fix it. There are cranes everywhere starting to rebuild what's been destroyed. But the great rebuilds will come after the war.
The philosopher Clausewitz once said, war is the continuation of policy through other means. Do you think that applies to Putin's war?
You correctly called it Putin's war, because it was him who wanted it. It's the result of an imperialist worldview, an attempt to recreate a greater Russia. He's the only one responsible. But of course, all wars end with diplomacy in one way or another, and we are pursuing that path. Emphasizing military aid doesn't mean we're not trying everything we can to reach a peace agreement. But you need both sides in order to make peace. For war, one side is enough.
One of your tasks as High Representative is to convince other countries that supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do. But we see that many African countries, as well as China, remain skeptical.
We need to have more exchanges, more discussions, in order to convey information to these third-party countries. Many people agree in principle. They say the war is bad, Russia is bad. But for me, this war has extremely heavy consequences. And it affects all of Europe. There are heavy material and human consequences. But we must also look at the broader historical context. Some countries have built close links with Russia. In Africa, for instance, former European colonies. In Latin America, there's also a feeling that this is another war between the US, its Western allies, and Russia. We must fight this narrative. You know, international diplomacy is always a combination of moral values and self-interest. Governments care about national interests. People care about moral values. We need to make that distinction.
Here we're back in Brussels in front of the European Commission in the morning. We've just seen European diplomacy in action. Thank you for being with us. Stay tuned on France 24.